Good morning. I'm glad to see all of you here for our grand finale. We've got a lot of interesting things to talk about, and before we get started, I will tell you all that it's been a great pleasure to do these classes. It's a labor of love for me. I will always talk about history. I love to talk about it, and there's always more and more to learn, such as Judy Barnes' deed abstract, the high school annual that has the old Hillsborough High School that burned a photo of that in it. There's so much here to be learned. Now, the question that I've had some difficulty answering was, who was Collis Jean? Collis Jean Road runs out here in front of Bellevue Middle School, and who was this? We assume it was a woman, since Jean was spelled Jeanne, but I finally did take off my shelf Ridley Will's book about the names of streets in Nashville, and sure enough, this is what he said. One question, of course, leads to 5 more questions. You resolve who Collis Jean was, now you've got to dig further. Collis Jean was the daughter of the business manager of the Davidson County schools in the 1930s. And so I can go to the archives and figure out who was the business manager of the Davidson County schools. But in the 1930s, and his daughter was born, her name was Collis Jean Corbett. I only know that the business manager's name was Corbett, but Collis Jean Corbett was born, according to Ridley, and many of you know Ridley, the day that the road was finished. So that is what Ridley has to say, and this will entail a little more seeing who Mr. Corbett was, and there's always something else to be learned.
And what was that date?
Pardon me?
What was that date?
Well, I think it was in the 1830s. I think it was probably right before World War II began. 1930s, excuse me. Yes, I'm a decade behind. I'm thinking about what I'm going to talk about next here today. I do want to go back to the end of the French and Indian War, and it was that moment that the war ended and Andrew Jackson became a national hero. The whole thing, Nashville really got put on the map right after the French and Indian War. It was clearly a frontier town before the war, but now we're getting national publicity. And above all, the city is growing dramatically. And it is here that we see the rich seeds coming to fruition of all of these folks that have come from the beginning for opportunity, and now you're going to see those opportunities really beginning to pay off, and you're going to see wealth, significant amount of wealth accumulated here. And so in this period, we're moving towards getting Andrew Jackson to Washington as president in 1829. So from 1815-16 to 1829, it is a period of tremendous growth in Nashville. And as goes Nashville, the surrounding counties, the surrounding areas began to grow and begin to thrive as well. We've still got a lot of people very busy with land speculation. Now that all of Middle Tennessee has been claimed, we're moving west into what had belonged to the Chickasaws before the War of 1812. We are looking at Alabama, which now is free of the creeks. We are looking across the river, even over as far as Arkansas. And during this period, before the French and Indian War, and it continues, you're going to see names that are really well known here suddenly becoming very important people in the story of Nashville history. I probably mentioned the first day that it wasn't really the original people who came with James and Charlotte Robertson that made wealth, that created wealth. Those were the pioneers. They made it easier for the next wave of people who came to really become financially very, very successful. So, for example, the McGavock family came in 1786. They came from Virginia. The patriarch of this family had come to Virginia from Ireland. Two of the brothers came over. They liked what they saw. They went back to Virginia. They came back here. Montgomery Bell came into Middle Tennessee about this time. In 1804, he had bought the Cumberland Iron Works from James Robertson. The iron foundries abound on that western side of the Highland Rim, Dixon, up to Erin, and there's several of those old foundries, pieces of the foundries still left over there. So the iron business was quite successful, and Montgomery Bell really amassed a large fortune in this building. How many of you have ever been to Montgomery Bell's tunnel? It is one of the technologically most interesting places in Middle Tennessee, in my opinion. He had slaves dig a tunnel across a narrow part of a ridge that was in a bend of the Harpeth River, and it was slanted to such a degree that a water wheel on the other side was propelled very rapidly, and in 2 circles of the water wheel, his tunnel with the water coming through could pound it with 2 circles. It could pound flat pig iron so that it could be then transported to market. The amazing thing about this tunnel is that it was all done with slave labor. There was no dynamite, and so how they were able to close off part of the river, there are no records about this, but it is really phenomenal. And sometime when your children are eager for a field trip and you want to take your grandchildren out to do something outdoors that'll use up a little of their energy, send them out over there to where Montgomery Bell's tunnel is. The state park system rangers sort of manage that site. There's a nice trail or two over there, and you can hike up on the ridge and you can see both sides of where the water came into the tunnel and then where it propelled the water wheel. Is really quite an achievement. He made a vast fortune here. Felix and Ann Rogers Grundy came about 1807. The Grundys had lived in Kentucky. Felix Grundy was a lawyer. He had been on the Superior Court of Kentucky. So why would he leave that position to come to Tennessee and more or less just hang out his shingle as a defense attorney? It was opportunity. It was land that brought them here as well. They saw the opportunity to get here. So you see all of these families coming in, and some of these folks, particularly the lawyers, really become sort of the conduit between what becomes a merchant class and what becomes the bankers, the people who invest in things. Those people have lawyers who kind of are the conduits, and in the meantime, the lawyers will benefit from these things as well. So here comes the steamboat. The steamboat had first come down the Ohio to the Mississippi River and then to New Orleans in the winter of 1811 and the early part of 1812. And this is when the New Madrid earthquakes occurred. There's a very interesting recollection of this by the captain of this steamboat, who his surname was Roosevelt. The water for a while went in a different direction. There were all sorts of dangers, trees coming down. It created Reelfoot Lake. And so that was the first steamboat, but the steamboats don't really come to Nashville till after the War of 1812. And this brings into this whole story an entrepreneur. And this is William Carroll. William Carroll was in the Tennessee militia. He was at New Orleans with General Jackson. but he had come from Pennsylvania. His family had been in the nail business, and they started manufacturing nails in Nashville. So he had already made some contacts with a steamboat company, an agent that was in charge of getting patents for various kinds of steamboats. He came from Pittsburgh, so he had contacted somebody there to see what it would cost to build a steamboat that could come up the Cumberland to Nashville. And he started urging investors in Nashville to invest in his steamboat company, the Nashville Steamboat Company. In the meantime, he went ahead and created a partnership with a ship captain, and they together owned their own small steamboat that they named Andrew Jackson. And it began operating in the spring of 1818. Now, this is bad timing, as it turns out, for Mr. Carroll, because the Panic of 1819 occurred, and he ended up losing his steamboat, but he was not to be deterred. He will get a bigger incorporated steamboat company going in 1819, and they will have the first ship on the Cumberland and they will call theirs the General Robertson for James Robertson. So he lost the General Jackson in the Panic, but the General Robertson goes up and down the Cumberland River for a few years, and this is what was so daring and so dangerous about steamboats. They had these boilers that operated with fire, and constantly there were combustible situations on these wooden boats. They were these side paddle boats. This is certainly not one that came to Tennessee. This is a replica of what these first boats, some of them actually did have sails on them, but you see they are a side paddle boat, and here is where the steam furnace is, right in the middle of the boat. So over the years, you have a lot of catastrophes when the boilers explode. Here, with the General Robertson steamboat, you have it hitting a snag, rocks, in the Cumberland River, just downstream from Nashville a little bit. Here you see Nashville on my map here, and here is Ashland City. This and not too far up, there's where the Harpeth flows into the Cumberland over there, and there are these rocks there that are called sometimes the Harpeth Shoals. And so whoever was the captain of the General Robertson did not realize those rocks were there. He hit that and destroyed his steamboat. But that is not to deter investors. By 1824, we had 6 steamboats that were owned by Nashville merchants. And of course, a merchant would want to own a steamboat because they can carry their goods out and bring goods in to sell to people here. Now, here are some statistics that I found very interesting that came from Anita Goodstein's book. Anita Goodstein's book is about early Nashville from 1800 to 1860, and she taught for many years at Sewanee at the University of the South. It is a very dense academic book published by the University of Florida Press, but the information in it is really excellent. It is all the history of the business community of Nashville and our local government, the Board of Aldermen, and the things that took place here before the Civil War. According to Dr. Goodstein, Nashville only had 3 steamboats docked at the dock, which was right at the end of Broadway, in 1819. In 1824, after this panic, and Andrew Jackson's running for president that year, we have 33 steamboats coming in and out of Nashville. That's 1824. In 1829, 5 years later, we have 102. steamboats coming in and out of Nashville. It was cheap transportation, free transportation, and if you could withstand the dangerous aspect of this, it was really quite a technological advancement for merchants and people who wanted to transport things. There is a Google map that I cut off last night so that you can kind of see where the Harpeth Shoals are. There is a man who lives here in Nashville who operates twilight tours on a boat in the fall to see the leaves, and he goes from Nashville, from one of the marinas out here in Bellevue up to the Harpeth River, and then he goes up the Harpeth River a little bit. Have any of you ever been on one of those boat trips? But they're really supposed to be really quite lovely. I myself have not had the opportunity to do that, but I understand they are really quite interesting to see that, and you can see, in fact, where the shoals are. But that's the problem with getting to Nashville. But once you have the navigation skills and know where it is, you will avoid it if you are the captain of a boat. So ultimately, they do. But they do have explosions from time to time. There's always going to be a dangerous element. There was an explosion, for example, in the 1840s up on the Mississippi, and several Nashville families were killed in the explosion. And I would think that would be a horrendous way to die, simply because it's boiling water that is what the explosion creates. And so it was quite difficult. Here we have a painting of the Cumberland River, and I do think it's interesting to look at that and think about what it is now and what it was then. On Sunday afternoon, I went downtown supposedly to take some photos of Fort Nashboro for another project I was working on, and I couldn't get to Fort Nashboro because First Avenue was closed, but I did go up on the pedestrian bridge. And if you haven't been on that bridge, it's really a lovely view. And I was just trying to imagine, I can see the Highland Rim around some parts of the city that aren't blocked by buildings, and just to imagine what that must have been like. I can't even begin to imagine what it would have been like to have been down there at the coming of the first Europeans who staked a claim here. Now, if we're going to have boats, we're going to need a bridge. And sure enough, the next thing that Nashville wants, the city wants, is a bridge over the Cumberland River. So here's an article that appeared in the Nashville newspaper, the Nashville Whig. They're going to have a meeting to talk about building a bridge across the Cumberland down there somewhere in the vicinity of the court square. They're asking people to come. Anybody who has the welfare of the town at heart should come to this meeting, an object of so much importance to the citizens and the county at large. We're happy to see public spirit manifested on this subject, for we have long wished to see a bridge across the Cumberland River, as well for the convenience of the public at large as for the improvement of Nashville, which has already become a place of considerable commercial importance, and by the acquisition of a bridge, many facilities would be rendered which are now impossible. So right here you see evidence that people by this period of time are thinking that Nashville is a commercial center. So they got some folks together to invest some money. They felt like they needed $110,000 subscribed in order to build this bridge. And they used a plan. Let me show you the picture of what the plan of the bridge. It was a covered bridge with some windows in it, and it was really actually quite low. This bridge itself ended up being torn down because it was too low, close to the water for big steamboats to get under as steamboats got bigger and bigger. But they got started on building this bridge in 1820. Now, the interesting thing about this is really the beginning of a strong Catholic community in Nashville. They needed extra labor. They needed sufficient workers to work on the construction of this bridge, putting the footings down. It's quite an enterprise. And Irish immigrants had come into Philadelphia as well as New York, and so they were given the opportunity to relocate to Nashville. And the business community, I'm sure the promoters of building a bridge, promised that they would build them a Catholic church if they would come. Now, Timothy de Montgomery had settled here about the time Tennessee became a state, and he was a Catholic, but he had to have confession and communion given more or less quarterly with a circuit riding priest. We usually think of circuit riders as Methodists, not Catholics, but there were circuit riding priests who came through here, and they would give communion, hear confession, give communion to de Montgomery's family, and they would go up to Sumner County and give communion to Hugh Rogan's family. Those were the two Catholics in the area. And so here we're going to have this almost ready-made community coming in, and the powers that be agreed to build them a church. They built the church called St. Mary's of the Seven Sorrows. The original building was on what became Campbell's Hill, which is now the hill where the state capital of Tennessee is. The St. Mary's of the Seven Sorrows was on the northeast side of that hill, not too far probably from where President and Mrs. Polk are buried there on the Capitol grounds. But the population grew, and they later built the church downtown, St. Mary's of the Seven Sorrows down there. So we bring in these laborers, and the Catholic community will grow rather rapidly. Many of the Catholics were poor laborers, and they lived in, of course, the less desirable parts of the town, which was along the river. And so in those communities along the river there, you see anytime there's an epidemic, it really goes through that Catholic community rather rapidly, and they were also prone to some flooding from time to time. So for the longest time, no one knew where this bridge was. And this is one thing that I really love about history. You don't have to have a degree in anything to be able to get the fire ignited to want to learn history. And several years ago, a couple of youngish men were very interested in tracing their Cherokee heritage. They had been told they were part Cherokee, and they wanted to trace this heritage. They really were not educated men at all, but they had a passion to find this out. And in this work on the Cherokees, they began to work on the actual route of the Trail of Tears, because there was no really understanding as to whether the trail really came exactly through Davidson County or not. And were people on boats going down the Cumberland River from here or not? There was a lot of disagreement about this. And so going through old records, they found that they had come straight one branch of the trail. The trail has many, many branches, and this took place over 1837 and 1838. I'm kind of getting ahead of this. Is after Jackson has become president, but Indian removal was passed while he was president. And they came right along the Stones River from Rutherford County to where it pours into the Cumberland River in Donaldson over approximately near Two Rivers. And then they came along the river there and the Cumberland River, and they crossed the bridge in Nashville. They crossed this pedestrian bridge. And they found the records where it was a toll bridge. They found the records of where the U.S. Army, who was bringing these Cherokees, helping them relocate, had paid to use the toll bridge. And people had thought the toll bridge was long gone, but then they got in a boat and started going up and down the Cumberland River, and sure enough, they found these footings, which are still pretty visible most of the time. I've been in a boat down here and seen them, and they're really kind of phenomenal. You know, they're hidden in plain sight. This is approximately where the Victory Memorial Bridge is today, that is right there beside the courthouse. And these footings are down there, and they walked right across Davidson County. So this is where this bridge was located, and it was used until a bigger bridge came along and replaced it. Now, in addition to things a city needs a proper cemetery. And so it is during this period of great growth, 1820, that some folks say, you know, this burial ground we've built over here, which was just above the public square, it's rocky, it's not very good soil. We need a more appropriate cemetery to bury our dead and to honor their memory. And so, according to the Board of Aldermen records, the Board of Aldermen, at the urging of Louisa Grundy McGavock and Alpha Kingsley, who was a translator for Jackson at one time, they persuaded the city to buy 5 acres on the plain south of Nashville. Now, I'm sure everybody knows where the city cemetery is. It's on the kind of the other side of the hill from, or the railroad tracks actually, from the Fort Negley Visitor Center there. The city cemetery is on 4th Avenue. It really is quite beautiful. They bought this acreage on the plain south of Nashville. Now, in my wildest imagination, I don't see anything in Davidson County as looking like a plain. But nonetheless, they began, really the accustomed format of a cemetery was you just buried people as they died. And then eventually, as the population grew, they began selling family plots around this original center of the cemetery as they bought more and more acreage. And as more people, the population grew and they have more funerals, that expanded probably to about 22 acres before it ceased to be the primary cemetery used. What is remarkable about this cemetery is that it was very unusual for Southern cemeteries. It was integrated. We did have Catholics buried there. See, we think of integration as being racial, but it also was religious as well. And so there was a substantial part of the cemetery for Catholic burials. Ultimately, we think most of those bodies were moved to Calvary Cemetery after the Civil War, but there was a Catholic section of the cemetery. We know that there were at least 1 or 2 Jews buried in that cemetery. If you know Harris Gilbert, a lawyer, he has an ancestor buried there in the city cemetery. And we also have African Americans buried in the cemetery. Felix Grundy had had his very faithful slave Ambrose buried in his plot. And there are other African Americans after the Civil War. 2 of the original Jubilee singers were buried there. In the fall, if you want an easy dose of history, go out and take the City Cemetery Living History Tour at twilight. It is absolutely more fun than you can imagine. It takes less than an hour, generally speaking, and you really get a sense of what Nashville was like. So it opened here in 1822, and I'm really proud to say it is really one of the most beautiful spots in Davidson County. You can go out there and walk around. There are businesses around the cemetery. It's really quite a lovely spot. Well, we also need to focus on education a little bit here. You know, we in the beginning had created Davidson Academy, and we'd had a variety of problems, all financial, with Davidson Academy, and then we had created Cumberland College, but that had had financial troubles, particularly with the Panic of 1819. So now that we've gotten through the panic, the leaders of the community say we really need a permanent college. We want our college to really shine in the South. So they persuaded an educator from New Jersey, Philip Lindsley, to come to town and be the president of this new college. And he came with the understanding that the name would change from Cumberland College to a brand new name, the University of Nashville. He comes in, he and his family arrive here in December of 1824. The news has just come that Andrew Jackson did not win the presidential election, so you can imagine what a stir Nashville is in at the time they arrive here. But he is a Presbyterian minister, and he is an educator. He's considered very prominent in the New England hierarchy of well-known educators, and I think he saw opportunity here and the great challenge of starting this university essentially from scratch. The city had before 1800 designated a hilltop for the land, to give land to the college, and so this is where the University of Nashville will be planted. Today it's 2nd Avenue, those hills there where the Howard School, Fulton Complex are, and there's one building back there of the University of Nashville still standing, and he got it going. He recruited a first-rate faculty to come to here. One of the most famous is Gerard Truus, a Dutch mineralogist and a geologist, and apparently he had a medical degree as well. So Gerard Truus comes to town. He will make a significant contribution to the state's understanding of its geology, and he is actually buried at the city cemetery. The Lindsleys are buried at Mount Olivet. So there is a building that still stands back there behind the Fulton Complex, but it's really in quite good shape. They will eventually establish a medical school there and train a significant number of doctors, but it does become, before the Civil War, the premier educational institution in the South. And it was Philip Lindsley who was so proud of what this school had been able to accomplish, and the students that came to his school, that he said, Nashville now is the Athens of the West. Yes, you thought I was going to say South, didn't you? You were about to put the words, but we forget that in 1830, I seem to have my decades confused today. In 1830, this was the West. And so he said this was the Athens of the West, and it did indeed grow. Now, on the darker side of our history, this is the point in time as Jackson, we're going into what historians refer to as the Age of Jackson, which mostly is from the mid-1825 era to about 1840. The Age of Jackson. Arthur Schlesinger wrote a very famous, I think, Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Jackson that was very successful. It was the Age of Jackson was what he named this period of time. But slavery is becoming a bigger issue. Now, the people who actually lived in town owned house slaves. Some of them owned property outside of the town of Nashville where they had farms. Some of the people in Nashville became plantation owners and actually owned plantations removed from Davidson County. For example, James K. Polk and his wife owned a plantation in Mississippi. And there's a wonderful new biography of Sarah Childress Polk for your readers that's not on my book list, but it's called Lady First. The author was here about a month ago, and I read her book, and it's really quite an interesting book about the power that Sarah Polk wielded while James K. Polk was in the White House and before he went, and then after his death, the power she wielded, the influence here in Nashville and in Davidson County. They had a plantation removed with an overseer down there. The Grundys and several others had plantations across the Mississippi River in Arkansas. And it is now understood that life on these plantations without a family living there was very difficult for the slaves. In other words, the neutralizing feature of having women and children there sort of restrained an overseer, and without a women and children of the landowner there, sometimes overseers got a little bit carried away. But Nashville and all of the South are getting nervous about the subject of slavery. Nashville had a small but significant population of free blacks, sometimes known as quasi-slaves, living here. And they began to sense a little hostility towards them. The Constitution of our state in 1796 gave free African Americans the full privileges of voting and other things, but now people are beginning to get nervous as the slave population of Tennessee, not so much Davidson County, but of Tennessee, begins to grow very, very rapidly. And so you will begin seeing advertisements in the Nashville papers looking for runaway slaves. And Nashville considers itself a fairly progressive community, but they're not quite sure how to deal with all of this. Now, for example, there were some people here who immediately said, we need to join a national movement to move the slaves and free blacks as well back to Africa. And of course, there are two problems. Is if I own a slave, who's going to pay me for my financial loss? Number two, what if the slaves don't want to go back to Africa because they speak English and they don't know, they have really no connection with what they're going to find when they get back to Africa, since they're several generations removed from Africa? And then the whole notion of how are we going to transport these people, that's also going to cost money. But there were several Nashvillians and folks from East Tennessee who formed the Tennessee Colonization Society, and it had a chapter here in Nashville. And they really worked on this, but it ultimately failed. This society didn't last very long, but they were at least talking about the problem. They really felt that slaves, even in 1829, slaves could not be freed and be able to live, that the white people and black people could not live in harmony in the same community. And so this becomes a bigger and bigger problem here. The Colonization Society really never gets very far along. And then in 1833, to get everyone in Nashville really, really nervous, a young man, he's a seminarian, he goes to Lane Seminary up in Ohio. He comes to town. He is doing what you might call a little mission trip. And he has some problem with his carriage, and without even thinking about it, he sends his carriage to a carriage repair place here in Nashville. And what does the man who finds his carriage find in it? Anti-slavery literature. And this created a crisis like Nashville had really never seen, because immediately they expect the worst, and he probably was coming south with anti-slavery literature for the purpose of distributing it. You know, you can't deny that. He was a seminarian, and in Ohio especially, you see a lot of the seminaries really emphasizing the need to abolish slavery because of the immorality of owning people. And so they have a trial, a very quick trial of him. They beat him in a public flogging on the city square in downtown in 1833, and then destroy his material and send him on his way, telling him never to come back. But this starts raising the what-ifs in Nashville. What if we had a major slave revolt? Nat Turner's slave revolt had already occurred in Virginia, and Nat Turner had done what other slave revolts had not done. He had been successful in arming a group of slaves with the assignment of killing your owners. Women and children were killed in Nat Turner's rebellion, and although the authorities rather quickly caught all of his co-conspirators, he was on the loose for over a month before he was caught. And of course, the plantation owners of slaves were living in terror during this period until Nat Turner was caught and tried. So here in Nashville, we are well aware of the potential of danger, particularly in West Tennessee and south of Nashville as well. And this trial does take place. Now, we're going to write a new constitution in 1834 for the state of Tennessee, and when that new constitution is written at the Constitutional Convention, the single biggest subject of debate, the most divisive subject, was slavery. They appointed a committee to deal with it, a subcommittee of the convention as a whole to deal with it. Some wanted to have some time limit, that as of a certain date, all slaves would be freed, or that slaves born after a certain date would be freed. But it was such a sensitive issue. The votes were very close because East Tennessee solidly voted against anything related to slavery. And West Tennessee was really nervous about this. So what they ended up putting in the Constitution by a very narrow vote was a section that said no one can free a slave without the owner's consent. Now that means the county court can't. That means the state legislature can't pass a law to abolish slavery. No one can free the slaves without the owner's consent. And in this Constitution, they took the voting rights away from free blacks living here. Mostly they were living in Nashville, but there were a few in Knoxville and other places as well. And so it becomes a very fragile time for free blacks living in Nashville who really have to be very cautious about what they say or do. We also got interested in educating girls. Imagine that. They decided, the leaders of the community invested in starting the Nashville Female Academy, and it is quite a fine institution for young ladies. It has a long and proud history up to the Civil War, and we are interested in educating girls as well. They took in some boarders from the counties around Davidson County, and it sits downtown, kind of on the edge of the gulch. It was sat there on the backside of the downtown YMCA, which you can't really see anymore because Amazon is under construction down there. There is a historic marker for the Nashville Female Academy. It's right there. But we are going to be on the national stage. It's the 1828, I'm still a decade off here, aren't I? The 1828 similarity is the comparable event to the NFL draft. When Andrew Jackson gets ready to run president, and after he loses, he then wins 4 years later. Now, he had a lot of people in Nashville who really thought he could be elected in 1824. The problem here was that the old Federalist Party of Alexander Hamilton and John Adams had died out. The Democratic Party, the Democratic Republicans as they were called, the Thomas Jeffersonian Party, was big, and there was this era of good feelings when we don't really have a very competitive presidential election. But you know how it is. All of life is politics. And whether you're in a church, whatever community, whatever club you're in, the board of the library, anything, the people you work with, all of life is politics. And as this big Jeffersonian party grew bigger and bigger with the ascendancy of James Monroe in this period of good feeling, the era of good feelings, suddenly the Jeffersonian Democrats start arguing among themselves. And the big issue here was the answer to the question, what should the national government be doing? And some of the members of this party began saying we want our national government to spend money, of course that's taxpayer money, on building useful projects that will benefit our country. Roads, bridges, canals, a big national university, an observatory. These people who began to call themselves National Republican Democrats, and they want the national government a little bit more expansive. And then on the other side, you have the Jacksonian Republican Democrats, and they pretty quickly dropped the Republican, and they don't want the national government spending money on these useful projects that are in your textbooks referred to as internal improvements. And so with the election coming in 1824, after James Monroe has served 2 terms, we have 4 candidates in the race. John Quincy Adams probably had more experience than just about anybody who's ever been elected president. He had been a diplomat, he had been Secretary of State, he had negotiated the Treaty of Ghent. He was a very popular citizen, well-known, high pedigree. His father was John Adams, and let's not forget his mother was Abigail in her own right. We have General Jackson, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, our second George Washington, and then we have William Crawford, a national politician from Georgia who had been Secretary of the Treasury, and finally we have the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Henry Clay. So the Constitution says that anytime we don't have a candidate receiving 50% plus 1 of the Electoral College vote, then the top 3 vote getters' names go to the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, you know, in our way of thinking, we can't remember an election that was decided in the House, but that's because we had political parties developing right here and now, and we have never had a situation. What the Founding Fathers who wrote the Constitution had in mind was that every state would nominate their favorite sons, and then you'd have this kind of winnowing process, and you'd get down to the top 3 names, and the House of Representatives would generally decide who was going to become president. So the way the vote comes out here is that Andrew Jackson, this is no surprise to us, we know he's popular, becomes the front runner. He wins the popular vote, and he gets more than any of the other candidates in the Electoral College, but he doesn't get 50%. Coming in second is John Quincy Adams. Coming in third is former Secretary of the Treasury, William Crawford. And the name who's going to be dropped from our list is Henry Clay, Speaker of the House. Now, I want you to start thinking about this. Henry Clay is not getting his name sent up. He's the Speaker of the House. He certainly has a lot of influence in the House of Representatives, doesn't he? So the names go to the House of Representatives, and after a fair amount of debating, the House decides that the person that the House is going to make president is John Quincy Adams. Now, we do not have a shred of evidence, not a single shred, no letter, no document, nothing. But, of course, Tennesseans are known for having tempers, and the Tennesseans and everybody else who supported Jackson is furious. So what conclusion are they going to jump to, whether it's right or wrong? They're going to jump to the conclusion that Henry Clay and John Adams made a deal, a corrupt bargain. And the reason they're going to think that this corrupt bargain was made is because as soon as John Quincy Adams became president, he appointed Clay as his Secretary of State. So for all practical purposes, the election of 1828, the campaigning started as soon as Henry Clay became Secretary of State. And John Quincy Adams did not have a really successful presidency. He was qualified, but he has all of these Jacksonians in Congress who were determined to stop everything he wants to do. He succeeded in getting the National Observatory, but he could not get the National University established, and he knew that Jackson was right on his coattails, wanting to become president. And so you see, as you look at this map, the votes were all over the place that year. There's no real regional distribution, I suppose, except for that corner up there above New York. New England was solidly for John Quincy Adams, but you've got this whole hodgepodge here. And although Clay got more, well, he got a lot of votes, he did not get his name sent to the House of Representatives. So the Tennesseans are mad, and poor John Quincy Adams knows he's going to have trouble on his hands. So 4 years later, look at how the map changed. We are calling the Jacksonians Democrats, and we're calling the Adams supporters the National Republicans. And by the time Jackson leaves the White House in 1837, he'll be succeeded by his vice president, Martin Van Buren. By the time Jackson leaves the White House, the National Republicans will have been started to call themselves the Whigs, because that is the party in England that opposed the power of the king or the monarch. And so the National Republicans become the Whig Party. And I don't want to spend too much time talking about Jackson's presidency. There are magnificent books about Jackson's presidency. All of the biographies, everyone has certainly a different take on Jackson's life. John Meacham's American Lion won a Pulitzer, didn't it? Didn't that book win a Pulitzer? There's another very fine biography by H.W. Brands about Jackson. They're the older biographies of Jackson. There are lots and lots, the Schlesinger biography, lots of biographies. So you can get kind of a different take on Jackson's presidency from all of these books. But in U.S. history, he is remembered for being a man of the people. That's how he campaigned for office. His campaign people sold him as a man of the people, not a gentrified person. Of course, if you go out to the Hermitage and take the tour, you see that he was a wealthy man. And he was an elite. And yes, he came from humble roots, but he was the American success story. The Hermitage was, in fact, a plantation. And so the things we look at for Jackson as the person who supported and signed the bill to force all Indian tribes living east of the Mississippi River, force them to move west of the Mississippi River into territory that would be reserved for them. And Indian removal was not really very controversial at all. You know, the anti-slavery people here in Middle Tennessee are much more vocal about being against slavery. There were very few people who would defend the Indians. And so this court case that the Cherokees brought to the Supreme Court about being forced to leave, Wooster v. Georgia, the signature name up here, Samuel Wooster, he was a Presbyterian minister who had gone missionary, who had gone down into North Georgia to New Eshota, the land of the Cherokees, and had run a school, had been a preacher, a missionary there, and the case gets to the Supreme Court, where Chief Justice John Marshall sided on behalf of the Cherokees, but that was not to be, because the sentiment in the South was move them out, move them out, move them out. There was only one congressman of all of Tennessee's delegation that dared to vote contrary to the president's wishes. He was from West Tennessee, David Crockett. And so David Crockett himself had some presidential ambitions, but Jackson doesn't just take his vote lightly. He supports Adam Huntsman to run against Crockett after the vote on Indian removal, and Crockett lost, and so you know what Crockett then did, which turned out to not be such a good decision when he went to Texas and died at the Alamo. But we associate Jackson's presidency with this. We see him taking a firm stand against South Carolina when South Carolina attempted to nullify a high tariff. Whether he would have put off the Civil War or not, I do not know. There's a lot of difference between the 1830 tariff fight and 1860. 30 years make a big difference. So some people say if Jackson had been president instead of James Buchanan, at the time South Carolina seceded. Now, granted, it was the election of Abraham Lincoln, the election, but before he was sworn in, that made South Carolina secede, but I don't know. And then the other thing that Jackson was known for that had the firm support of many Americans was killing the Bank of the United States. And that did affect some of the commercial people here in Tennessee. And so there's a significant commercial population of Nashville who become rather anti-Andrew Jackson, and they will become the backbone and the nucleus of the Whig political party. Here is a map of the route of the Trail of Tears, and you see the dotted line there is this newest route. The National Park Service is working on getting signage down there close to where the Victory Memorial Bridge is, and it really is quite a remarkable thing. You probably know this, but the Indian Removal Act was all tribes. The Cherokees referred to it as their Trail of Tears. Somebody wrote this in their diary, one of the Cherokee women who was forced to leave. And so it took all forms. There was not one trail. As you see from this route, there were land routes, there were water routes, and then there was this group that came right through Nashville, which is so exciting to think that it has been done. I went with a group from Historic Nashville down along the Stones River to where part of the trail was, and you see the National Park Service has some signage up right down there already. If you don't know where you're going, and I certainly could not lead a group down there because having gone, I could not replicate the path we went on, but it was really quite interesting to see that and to walk along the Stones River and imagine them. There's the footing. I took that picture from a boat, as you can see, and there's the footing, which you can see very prominently, and the courthouse is just right up here. It's really within stone's throw of the public square, as it was called. So Jackson killed the second Bank of the United States. Interestingly enough, this bank that Jackson killed, the headquarters were in Philadelphia, and the building was designed by somebody that nobody in Tennessee ever heard of until the 1840s, when William Strickland, the architect, got the contract to design Tennessee a permanent state capital. But by the time Jackson left office, there were a lot of Nashvillians, Whigs, who did not like him. They were led by Congressman John Bell, who had opposed some of Jackson's financial dealings. He is considered one of the founders of the Tennessee Whig Party. He has the distinction of running for president in 1860. He did not like the Democratic nominees. The Whig Party has died out. His own party has died out. He did not like the Democratic nominees for president, Stephen Douglas and John Breckinridge. He did not like the new Republican Party's nominee, Abraham Lincoln. The Republican Party had grown out of the Whigs who supported free soil, limiting slavery to where it existed. And he did not support that party either. So he and some of his like-minded friends said, we don't like any of the nominees. We will create our own third party, the Constitutional Party, and he will run for president in 1860, unsuccessfully, but he will run for president. His political nemesis, Congressman Bell's, is James K. Polk, who Polk will work very successfully at getting Jackson's wishes passed by the House of Representatives. And he will become the Jacksonian who succeeds in getting elected president. And what did not happen while Jackson was president was that Texas, which had won its independence from Mexico in 1836, was not admitted to the Union. And Texas, I'll give you just a tiny bit of little Texas history because Davidson County people were all over the place out there. A lot of Tennesseans from Middle Tennessee went out to colonize Texas. Why did they want to go into northern Mexico to be a colony of Mexico? Because there are all these rivers that flow right into the Gulf of Mexico, ideal spots for raising cotton. Mexico had abolished slavery from the time they became a country. They did not have slavery. They really wanted anybody who set up a colony there to become Catholic. They did have a state religion, and they did have a state language, which was Spanish. And Americans go out there. The one you know the most about is Moses Austin, whose son, Stephen F. Austin, became the founder of that first colony. But as soon as that colony gets going, then we have one of the Robertson grandchildren, Sterling, seeing the opportunity out there, and he will become what is known as an impresario of Texas, and he will get a contract from the government of Mexico to create his own colony. You see here on this map the colony of Robertson right there in the middle of all of this. And so we have a significant number of Nashvillians out there. Why are they out there? Because of opportunity. And once you get one group established, you have another. And why did the government of Mexico initially think this was a great idea? Because the Indians of the Plains were constantly raiding the missions, the Mexican missions up here in this northern province, and they thought that putting Americans there would be a good buffer against the Indians. And so the Americans come in, but they never see themselves as anything other than Americans. And so they never wanted to be part of Mexico. And when Mexico tries to sort of tighten the reins on them, they rebel, and the leader of the rebellion is General Sam Houston, another protege of Jackson and former governor of the state of Tennessee. So we have lots of Nashvillians who are out there and stay out there. If you go to College Station, that's where Texas A&M is. Robertson, there is a county in Texas today, right there where my era is, called Robertson County. There is the county courthouse of Robertson County. Its county seat is Franklin, Texas. So in 1836, Jackson's hand-picked candidate for the Democrats wins, Martin Van Buren, but the Tennesseans really did not vote for Van Buren. They voted for Hugh Lawson White, a Whig from Knoxville. So Jackson does not hold control of the state. In fact, his Democratic Party is in such a disarray that he is the one who convinces James K. Polk to come back to Tennessee and run for governor so that the Democrats can retake the power of the state house from the Whigs, who have now taken control of the governor's office with Newton Cannon. And Polk does come back. He is elected governor of the state of Tennessee in 1839. But the Whigs have a tremendous amount of political power here, particularly in Nashville. And even though Polk is a Democrat, he is always going to have to deal with the capital being in what is known as Whig City. The Whigs were so powerful here and so dominant in the political spectrum. So Polk is elected governor in 1839. the Whigs don't really panic with John Bell kind of organizing things. Who can we find that will provide a contrast to the statesman James K. Polk? And so they want to find somebody that the voters will like and vote for, and they find someone to run against him in the form of James Chamberlain Jones, who will run against him as Polk is the incumbent running for governor. Jones was everything that Polk was not. Polk was college educated. He had gone to the University of North Carolina. He's a very dignified man. Jones had been a little bit involved in politics, but not much, and he's just kind of a good old boy. He runs against Polk and wins in 1841. Surely that was a fluke. Polk has lost the governor's race. 1843, he runs again and wins. It would seem that James K. Polk's political career is over, but nay, not so. In 1844, when the Democrats cannot find a candidate who will please both the anti-slavery and pro-slavery sides of the party, the pro-expansion side of the party, they will come to Polk, and Polk will be elected president in 1844 as a dark horse candidate. The reason that Polk defeated Henry Clay was because a third party appeared, the Liberty Party, that wanted to contain slavery to the states where it existed in 1844, and it got just enough votes away from Clay so that Polk won the electoral vote and became president. The big issue in this campaign, make Texas a state. And the Tennesseans were all over make Texas a state, but you see, we did not vote for our favorite son. The election of 2000 was not the first time that Tennessee had not voted for its favorite son. In 1844, we did not vote for Polk. So we go into the Mexican War from here. The whole state of Tennessee seems to be excited about going to war with Mexico. Texas becomes a state in 1845. The spark that starts this war is a border dispute between the Texans and the government of Mexico. And from this point forward, the Mexican War, the biggest political issue that's going to dominate and cloud everything else is, now that we have expanded all the way to the Pacific Ocean, should slavery be limited to the 15 states where it exists, or should new territories be allowed to vote as to whether or not they want to be slave or free? And that starts with the coming of the Mexican War, which opponents of Polk said was nothing but a land grab. It intensifies with every presidential election, and it comes to a boiling point in 1860 when Abraham Lincoln, a former Whig, who said over and over again, I have no right to abolish slavery. It is unconstitutional. I cannot abolish slavery. I just want to see that it does not expand. Lincoln won the election, and this time South Carolina decided to leave the Union, and when South Carolina seceded, a whole group lined up and seceded right behind South Carolina. Now, in closing here, as you know, I'm intentionally skipping the Civil War and moving right on to 1870, with Nashville 102, which is going to start after the Civil War. I want to just say a few words about the Civil War and Nashville, because again, this is another part of our history that I think people really don't quite understand. Tennessee had 2 votes on whether to leave the Union or stay in the Union. The first one was in February of 1861, before Abraham Lincoln was sworn in. The second was in June of 1861, after the attack on Fort Sumter, and Lincoln called for troops. Nashville was very divided over secession. But when Lincoln called for troops, many Nashvillians did reluctantly support secession. Having said that, there were a significant population of Nashvillians who were strong Unionists. Felix Fogg, a lawyer here in town, strong Unionist. The Lindsley family, strong Unionists. And so the Union Army came in very quickly, and the city was surrendered to the Union Army within 2 weeks of the Battle of Fort Donelson. Nashville, Tennessee became the safest place, one of the very safest places you could live during the Civil War in a seceded state. The Union Army controls the city. Their soldiers are told to leave the citizens alone. You have food to eat. Your preachers may be gone to prison because they refuse to take an oath of allegiance to the Union, but you have a certain level of freedom within this city that other Southerners living, for example, out here in the country do not have, as one army or another is coming across your land, taking your cattle, taking your chickens. But in Nashville, you were safe. And so to summarize the Civil War here in about 1 sentence, or maybe 3, I don't say much in 1 sentence, do I? To summarize it, from the point that the Union Army took Nashville without a shot being fired, the military objective of the Confederate Army of Tennessee was to retake Nashville, to liberate it. They tried it from Shiloh. They tried it from Perryville, Kentucky. They tried it from Murfreesboro. They tried it from Columbia and Franklin. Nashville was held throughout the Civil War by the Union Army. And if you really are a military buff here, you will know that Nashville, according to the fact that you look at the Confederate States of America as being an independent country, Nashville has been held by an enemy force, meaning the Union Army, longer than any other town in the United States. So as you can see, I'm always looking for opportunities to preach what I like to call Nashville exceptionalism. We are different from the rest of the South. I think that we have such a rich history, and take the time to get out and learn something new about what this town has meant, how we got to having an NFL draft in downtown Nashville, what took place in between 1870 and Nashville becoming the destination point of more bachelorette parties than any town in the country. So how did we get to this point? It's been a pleasure teaching the class. You have my email address. Send me an email anytime you want to, and let me know what you're up to. We have the course evaluation here that you can hand to Caroline as you leave. And one last announcement, on May 9th, a Thursday afternoon at 4:30 in the downtown public library, the Metro Historical Commission and the Metro Historic Zoning, I guess, supports this too, will have their annual Historic Awards ceremony. Not only do they give awards to some folks, but they also give awards which are really, really interesting to people who have remodeled their houses and done it in a historically acceptable fashion. So it's a free, the parking is down there at the public library, and if you want to come and learn a little history, go there. We are very fortunate to have this magnificent library system. It's one of the real livability issues in Nashville. We have parks, we have libraries, we have all sorts of musical opportunities, cultural opportunities. Enjoy living here in Nashville. Thank you very much. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information about this and other programs, visit nashville.gov.